We're calling the Retail Committee regular meeting for Wednesday, September 18, 2024 to order. Will Mr. Clerk please take roll?
Councilmember Burt. Here. Councilmember Licott-Haynes.
Here.
Chair Koo.
Here. Thank you so much. All here? Okay, very good.
All here. Not
Thank
present.
you. Thank you. We'll move to our very first item, which is going to be public comments. If there's any public comments that are not on the agenda, please, will you let us know, Mr. Clerk?
There are no public comments at the moment.
Okay. Thank you so much. Then we'll move straight into action items. Action item number 1 is a discussion and recommendation to City Council to initiate various near, mid, and long-term amendments to the city's zoning Title 18 that's related to the City Council's economic development and transition priority. Let's get to Steve.
Thank you, Lydia, and for the reminder that we're able to be informal here.
Absolutely.
So shortly, I'll turn it over to John, our Director of Planning and Development Services, to cover most of this topic. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping off the top. As mentioned briefly before the meeting started, it was a large packet. We were able to distribute it in advance this time, make sure y'all had time to review the materials. We do have a couple PowerPoints that we'll be running through. The first item really is a meaty and substantive policy topic, and we're really hoping to engage the Retail Committee in discussion about how we want to proceed with this. It responds to a number of comments and frankly recommendations we've heard from the business community on how the city can be addressing our regulatory environment. And so we're hoping to engage most of our time with the Retail Committee on this topic today. And then at the tail end, we will have some time to talk about the Economic Development Activity Report, if that's what the committee chooses to do. With that, I'll turn it over to John.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Good morning, committee members, Chair. Can we have the presentation? So I'm Jonathan Late, Director for Planning and Development Services, and I have well, I'll just walk you through this presentation. It'll be brief at times and maybe a little more expansive at others. We can go to the next slide. Just by way of background, of course, the City Council has long been interested in the economic vitality of the community. In the last couple of years, it's been elevated to a council priority as we've begun to navigate the pandemic and then transition from it. And so over the past several years, there's been a number of efforts that we've identified in our staff report that we've been working on to help improve the city's resiliency and vitality for economic purposes. This work that we're presenting to you today follows along from work that was preceded by Street Sense in their report, and then Michael Baker International, who Dan Weary is our consultant who's supported us on this, is present and available online if there's questions later about the report itself. Next slide, please. The Planning and Transportation Commission has met a number of times this year to discuss the Michael Baker report and has reviewed a variety of near to long-term recommendations, which we'll briefly go over. And happy to expand upon these if there's questions after the presentation. So there are 15 total recommendations. Not all of them were supported by the Planning and Transportation Commission. We'll highlight some of those. But in terms of, and this is ranked in the order of sort of near term to longer term priorities. And this too is in direct response to the retail ad hoc's request to identify specific near-term actions that can be taken that we can implement quickly. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll identify a couple of process options for the committee to consider. The first recommendation it serves to create an equal standard for parking requirements for retail and retail-like uses. So those uses that we would identify as retail and retail-like would have the same parking standards so that we're not creating a barrier to entry because of the parking requirements. So you can think about this in the context of retail, a furniture store might have a lesser parking requirement than a retail store. A retail store would have a lesser requirement than a restaurant. in our code today. And so the idea with this recommendation is to blend all of those into one parking standard so that we can have that interchangeability of a restaurant going into a furniture store or a retail store without having to provide additional parking. The second recommendation is to adjust the formula retail provisions. This really only applies in California Avenue, where that standard has applicability. And the request here is, and supported by the PTC, is to change the threshold for any business that's meeting the formula retail definition in our code. If there are, the current standard is if there's 10 or more of those across the nation, then a conditional use permit is required before it can be established in the California Avenue area. The recommendation is to change that from 10 to 50 and also to limit it to just restaurants and not other retail uses, which is currently the standard today. Number 3 is was identified as a near-term recommendation, but as we stated in the staff report, as it was modified by the Planning and Transportation Commission, this one requires a little bit more of a nuanced analysis. So staff looks at number 3 here as a midterm recommendation if the ad hoc and council ultimately were to support the PTC's recommendation. But ultimately, what this seeks to do is either reduce the geographic applicability of the retail preservation ordinance or make it easier for non-retail uses to be established where that provision applies today. Recommendation 4 has to do with changes to the parking requirements as it relates to AB 2097. As noted in the report, this is something that the City Council as a whole will be taking up in October, we believe. So there's no need to weigh in on that particular recommendation at this time. Number 5 is simply putting together what uses are permitted where in the city. This is a best practice that would make it easier for brokers, property owners to understand what land uses are allowed in their on their property. And we're talking specifically for commercial uses. Recommendation 6 would extend a provision of the retail preservation ordinance that exists today called an alternative viable use to areas of the ground floor combining district and the retail combining district. Again, creating the opportunity for a little more flexibility to establish non-retail or retail-like uses in these areas, subject to certain criteria. Number 7 was supported, 7.1 was supported by the PTC, and 7.2 conceptually was supported by the PTC, noting that they wanted to have a little bit more, and thank you for following along on the slide deck, wanted to have a little bit more discussion on how that might have applicability. But this one is an important one, number 7, because it really gets at how we define what retail and retail-like uses are and creating more opportunities for uses that we wouldn't traditionally consider retail or retail-like to be established in the city. We can expand more upon that. And then 7.2 and somewhat related to 8, recommendation 8, is exploring opportunities where non-retail or retail-like uses might be able to occupy a portion of a tenant space that is otherwise committed or required to be retail on the ground floor. Recommendation 8 also would raise the conditional use permit threshold from the current 1,800 square feet threshold to 3,000 square feet. And then on the next slide, we start transitioning to more midterm recommendations, and staff has noted that for recommendations 11 and 13 on this slide, that the recommendation is that these be folded into recommendation 15. 11 would seek to better align parking demand for a particular use to the parking requirement as opposed to the standards that we have in our code today. Often people will report that our standards based on ITE models, Institute of Traffic Engineers, doesn't necessarily correlate to an urban or suburban environment that we have here. And then recommendation 13, skipping over 12 for a quick moment, would be to create more subjective conditional use permit standards. This has some value, but I would note that it has limited value and only particularly to the when we deny a conditional use permit application. It doesn't have much bearing on the approval of a CUP, but it is something that is worth exploring. The staff recommendation is that we push this to the comprehensive zoning code amendment. Recommendation 12 that I skipped over. This again, the staff isn't requesting the ad hoc take any action on this right now because the council will take up this discussion in October. And on the next slide, this is the long-term recommendation because it will take several years to implement and cost $1 to $2 million to pay for this effort. Is a comprehensive update to the zoning code. This is an extensive process and would be a complete sort of redo on how we would carry over many of the regulations that we have today. We would look for opportunities to make them clearer, use texts and graphics and formatting to make it a document that's easier to administer and read by the public. Next slide, please. There were 3 recommendations not supported by the PTC. 2 of them related to office-related uses. And we can have more of a discussion on this, but staff views these as discrete efforts that may require more analysis and really ought to be considered a distinct work plan objective should the ad hoc or city council desire to make changes to the office restrictions. Next slide, please. And then lastly, recommendation 14. This doesn't have direct applicability to retail uses, commercial activity. It's more related to residential uses. It's a component of how we address parking management downtown and how do we support more walkable environments in commercial areas, but it's state law and no action is actually required by the city to implement this. So no action is recommended be taken on recommendation 14 at this time. Okay. And then finally, with the last slide, next steps, just a couple of options on how to proceed. We've heard from the committee that there's a lot of interest in wanting to move quickly. And so we've presented a couple of options for the committee to consider. What is not included in this option is a even more expanded process. We sort of cut out the most extensive process of how we would move forward with this, engaging community feedback and meetings before the PTC and again before this committee. What's proposed for you is that if there's consensus by the committee on the recommendations that the PTC and staff are forwarding, that we would send this to the city council on consent calendar for their endorsement. And once endorsed, staff would return back to the city council after going through the Planning and Transportation Commission with an ordinance for to be able to review and have the opportunity to adopt or make changes. The second, more expedient path would have the committee directing staff to just prepare the ordinance changes and then return to the city council without having done additional public outreach. So that means not going back to the Planning and Transportation Commission, but taking the information that we have to date and having staff and our professional services team draft some proposed language for the council's consideration. It's more expedient, but at the same time, it does then push the public dialogue and discussion to the city council, which may have other implications. Okay, so that concludes the staff report. Happy to answer any questions. Again, we have our Dan Weary, who helped prepare the report, available to answer questions about the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one point I want to add to this. These conversations have been underway for a while now. This is the culmination of a lot of work, and we are not the only city looking at expanding our uses in our commercial cores. So Mountain View just did this last week. They expanded their permitted uses in their downtown core. They now allow indoor recreation uses without a conditional use permit, and they can allow alcohol without a conditional use permit if it's beer and wine and ancillary to that use. Same with restaurants. They are now allowing restaurants to proceed serving alcohol as long as it's ancillary to the main restaurant use without a conditional use permit. So these conversations are not unique to Palo Alto. It's something that many cities are looking at as they look to options for how to increase the vitality of their commercial cores. And so I just wanted to add that context as we continue this conversation.
Thank you. I just have a question. I want to understand the how robust were the meetings that are at PTC when this subject comes forward? Because I mean, based on the recommendation that staff has provided, it'd be good to know if there was a lot of attendance from the public stakeholders when it goes to PTC.
Thank you. So there were, again, a number of meetings, and there was some attendance online, people watching. There was not a lot of public engagement in terms of public comments on the different discussion points. There were at times, 2 or 3 individuals that I'm recalling that have participated.
Okay, because I mean, that's kind of important because PTC actually goes through the technical matters. And it would be important for the public stakeholders to be engaged so that when the recommendation from PTC comes forward after they have examined and analyzed all the different recommendations and suggestions, then they could take the input of the public while they're making those analysis. But anyways, so it's good to know for us. Thank you. Okay, bring it back to council, to committee. Would you like to go ahead, Pat?
So if we can go back to slide number 4. On the third item, it's presented as an either or, easing restriction on non-retail or reducing the geographic applicability. Is that meant to be literally that choice, or is it and or?
And so on the slide deck, it's, a little bit shorthand language. The recommendation that is expanded upon in the attachment is either repeal the retail preservation ordinance or amend the retail preservation ordinance. And the amendment would include looking at the geographic span, which you have some attachments in your packet that show maps of its applicability now, or to make it easier for a property owner, broker to demonstrate that a non-retail use is appropriate at that location.
And John, if we were to amend to the council member's question, we could do the geographic applicability and ease the restrictions on retail use, if that was.
So that's the essence of what I'm getting at. It's really and or.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And just commenting then, well, I'll wait until comments on that. And then within that easing restriction on non-retail, my recollection of the Planning Commission discussion was that there was discussion of both, basically a carte blanche elimination of non-retail, of allowing any office, or a more nuanced one of allowing services or certain more appropriate uses than eliminating it completely from the geographic area. Where does staff stand on that, or where do we stand on that aspect?
Yeah, so for retail preservation, again, we think this requires a more nuanced approach to how it would apply. I think there are areas where retail preservation probably doesn't need to extend as extensively as it does. We have some other policy documents in the city, and I'm thinking specifically of the guidelines for the South El Camino Real area that has identified this notion of nodes of commercial activity. Certainly, those would be areas that we'd want to retain retail preservation, or at least have some standards for it. There's also some regulatory aspects of the ordinance itself that require a square foot for square foot replacement of retail. And in some areas, we've reduced that to say replace it with 1,500 square feet. But I think that's another area that we could take a look at it. So from a staff perspective, we think that there's opportunities to make some refinements to the retail preservation ordinance if the council doesn't want to go so far as to just rely on the ground floor GF and R combining districts.
And then under the notion of the possibility of an emergency ordinance, had staff looked at rather than all of these nearer term things be under the emergency, which of them might be more appropriate for the emergency ordinance?
And did we reference an emergency ordinance in the staff report?
Urgency.
Did we say
sorry.
urgency? I don't know that it wouldn't necessarily need to be an urgency ordinance. We could, but it would, well, so we can talk a little bit more about the process. It is a whether it's an urgency ordinance or an interim ordinance that just goes straight to the city council. I think those are two paths that we were at least intending to articulate. And as far as what could be included in that, all of the near-term items could be included in that, with the one caveat about the retail preservation piece. And if you selected, as the committee selected, not to include some of the near terms, then we can forego that and we can pick that up subsequently.
And on the recommendation number 1 on the interchangeability of uses without triggering our current parking requirement increases. I've long been concerned that we, for instance, on Cal Ave, we didn't even have a mechanism for if someone wanted to go from a traditional retail into a food and beverage. We didn't even have a mechanism for them to pay in lieu fees. They simply couldn't do it because we didn't have any mechanism. And I conceptually support reducing those barriers, but have we looked at long-term, if we're in a direction of greater online sales and fewer traditional goods being sold, and more food and beverage, the overall impact over an extended period of time on our parking availability, combined with our intention to have significant residential downtown, combined with AB 2097, where that residential, the city cannot mandate parking requirements. Our residential permit parking programs were all designed for restricting the amount of intrusion in neighborhoods during the day and evening. The future would be nighttime potentially overflow from underparked residential next to, in the downtown area next to those existing neighborhoods. So have we looked at the aggregate impact of those forces over an extended period of time?
So I guess the short answer is no, but again, I think there's some more context to that. The recommendation here doesn't have a significant impact, at least in terms of our ability to affect policy in our two downtown areas, within a half mile of Cal Ave train station and the University Avenue train station, simply because parking would not be required for any of those uses under that state law. Where this begins to have more of a potential impact, where the city does retain some regulatory controls outside of those areas. And so, for instance, Midtown or Charleston or areas that may not be impacted by AB 2095, if we started seeing a lot more parking intensive uses that we're also categorizing as retail or retail-like, it's conceivable that there could be some, increased parking challenges in those areas. But that's a threshold that we don't know, and I don't know how we would actually map that out to understand sort of the long-term implications. Understanding, of course, all of those different components that you said, and then also recognizing, at least at this moment in time, it appears that our parking resources are not fully being utilized.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And that's why I'm talking more kind of the long-term projection. I don't see near-term challenges from that. But let's talk a little bit about AB 2097 and how it relates here. So under 2097, we can't mandate any parking, but we don't have to allow the interchangeability of uses. So is there a way that we could condition interchangeability on a certain amount of parking or an in lieu? So that it's not a by right, it's a conditional issue.
I think I'd have to collaborate with our city attorney's office further to give you a firm answer on that. My initial inclination is no, but I think that would require some more discussion.
I agree with you. It also strikes me that at a minimum, I think, Councilmember, what you're suggesting might fall under a conditional use process such that to the extent that the focus here is to enable more or to facilitate the filling of these retail-like spaces, that would likely conflict with that goal.
Well, I understand that, and I think there's a real tension. I want to liberalize them as well, but I don't want to go carte blanche. And so that's the real issue. And we look at one half of, we want to liberalize it, and the state says, but once you do that, you lose complete control. And I haven't seen how we're recognizing that tension.
The state does take positions on increasingly more local land use issues. I know that for housing, if we make changes to our density, our development standards, there's the significant challenge for a local jurisdiction to roll that back. I don't know of a similar consideration for parking other than of course AB 2097. Which establishes this. So, understanding that tension, I don't have an answer.
Okay.
To
and then
address that.
The other question related to 2097, we had the series of issues come up when we were looking at the NV cap. What's the definition of the distance from the train station? HCD had their own missive that I read and found very questionable, that basically 2097 is intended to identify basically a half-mile walking distance to a train station. And the HCD said, that boundary is not where you're going to get on a train. It's the furthest most point of the parking lot to get on the train, where the whole principle AB 2097 is not to drive. And so what's our premise here? Because we haven't had any additional clarification since that NV cap, where we had different interpretations emerge by our legal staff in the middle of the meeting.
Right. And so are you're referring to recommendation number 4, perhaps, or?
Well, really, as it applies to any parking related liberalization, it's what's the geographic boundary that it applies to. And then related to that at the same meeting was, do we or don't we have the authority to require ADA parking and EV requirements.
Understanding those questions and recalling, of course, that meeting regarding NVCAP. This is the reference in the staff report to not, we're not seeking ad hoc guidance on those issues because we're going to bring those very issues to the city council in October. And so the question of the EV parking and the accessible parking and the measurement of distance, these are all things that we're going to bring back to the city council. And we're still working on that.
Okay, well, I will say that I went back and read the legislative record, and it was quite clear the intent of the law was to not exclude EVs and ADA parking. So I'll just note that. And think, just the alcohol not requiring a CUP. Had staff considered whether that we would look at beer and wine versus full alcoholic licenses?
So none of the recommendations change the city's current process for obtaining a conditional use permit for alcohol in Palo Alto. I believe there was a reference following my presentation, or perhaps at the beginning, where Mountain View has taken that course. That's not a part of the recommendations that we have before the committee today, but if that was something the committee were interested in, we could further explore that.
Okay, thank you.
I think that fits neatly into recommendation 15 as we look at the long-term stuff and we understand, the fewer uses we can require a CUP for, generally the better. The greater certainty we can introduce into our processes, the better. And so I think it fits neatly into that comprehensive zoning update.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I want to put that off to the long term. I'll give you an example that we had several years ago. The Hana House had wanted to have beer and wine and had pushback from some neighbors who were more concerned on other overflow parking issues that really were tangential to this, and it didn't go forward. And I had thought it would have been a positive contribution to the downtown area, and very possibly would have influenced whether we still have them as a user.
Thank you. Julie?
Sure thing, thank you. I am gonna talk as little as possible because my coughing is not COVID, but annoying, I know, to you and to me. I want to just commend the comprehensive nature of this effort. It feels that there's an exciting, deep, comprehensive momentum, and I find myself just feeling game to go for it. I do have a question about the comparable cities, Redwood City, Los Altos, and Santa Monica, 3rd Street Promenade. Given that Burlingame has come up in this meeting a number of times, I'm just wondering if you could give us a sense as to why those three were chosen and not our city neighbor up the street, who seems to be sort of the belle of the ball right now.
Yeah, I think fair comment, and I think perhaps criticism of the report. We had started this a couple of years ago, even still before it went to the PTC at the start of this year, sort of in parallel when the Street Sense report was going on. And we had just identified different cities at that time. But understanding that Burlingame was an oversight that probably should have been included.
Thank you. That's it for me.
So I just wanted to announce also that Julie has a hard stop at 11. So want to kind of move us to include Julie in the discussion, even though we have a quorum. So I wanted to ask, when I read somewhere near term is within 6 months, right? That's how you're defining. Can you tell me midterm and long term? What is the time frame that you have allocated to it?
So near term is 6 months from council authorization. So when the city council accepts the committee's report or we otherwise receive direction. There's only one near term recommendation really based on the staff recommendation. and that is the retail preservation amendments.
Amendment.
And that's about 18 months timeframe.
And that is the one that is whether council decides to repeal or amend it? Is that,
Yeah, that's the recommendation.
that's the
And the
one.
PTC recommendation is to not repeal,
Yeah.
but to amend.
Amend,
And
right.
the repeal is easy. That could be done in 6 months. But the amendment requires more analysis.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with their recommendation. So in the repealing language that is in the staff report, it says repealing the retail preservation ordinance eliminates its provisions, but retains the ground floor retail requirements in the GF and R combining districts. Can you help me understand what does retain the ground floor retail? If you're repealing it,
There's two different policies, three actually different policies. There's in the downtown area and portions of Middlefield, there is a combining district it's been on the books for a number of years now, long before the retail preservation ordinance. And that's the ground floor combining district. That requires ground floor retail uses already. Those would stay in place even if the retail preservation ordinance, which is a much more has a more citywide approach, even if that was lifted, we would still retain the ground floor combining district. Same with the R combining district.
so in essence, it's no longer citywide. It would be in particular just the GF and R districts.
That's right. And included in your packet are two maps that
Right.
show those areas.
Yeah, so amending it, I think that is, and then to kind of further understand the new definitions for retail and retail like would be also valuable too. I think also with the map, generally looking at where is the high demand for the retail and retail like, and which other areas nearby that would not be so appropriate for retail would be helpful as well. Also, I still think that AB 2097 needs further examination and for us to further understand what its totality means. And so I'm not quite ready to have parking interchangeability until I understand it a little bit more, which wasn't described very much in the report. And when it says modest adjustments to parking requirements, so what is modest?
In some areas, it's looking at, so parking is typically based on the square footage of the use. And so in some instances, we have a 1 to 250 parking requirement, one space per every 250 square feet of floor area. In some cases, it's 1 to 200 square feet. It does get a little bit more distance between those when we start talking about restaurants, which I'm trying to recall off the top of my head if it's one space for every 45 square feet or 60 square feet, something like that. For like dining area, and then the back of house is calculated at 1 to 200 or 1 to 250. And then for retail or for commercial recreation, there's another standard as well. Modest, I guess, is a subjective term, so probably best not to include that in the report. But noting that again for our core commercial areas, in light of AB 2097. They're all considered, there's just no parking required for those. So where it has, I think, more of an impact is, again, on Middlefield, Charleston, El Camino, of course, is another area.
Another thing, with regards to loosening or eliminating the CUPs for certain retail and retail like, and if alcohol is involved as well, how do we, what kind of levers are put in place for noise and bad behavior? I mean, I know on Lytton, there's one establishment where the neighbors at the back have constantly said that it's very noisy late into the night, and I guess they're backing up to residential. So how without a CUP, can that still be controlled, regulated?
So restaurants
I just want to make sure, bars, restaurants, whatever, if they're too close to residential, what kind of
Right.
noise ordinance or noise regulations that we might have that actually works.
Okay, so the zoning code does set forth a number of objective standards about what kind of activities can take place when in the city. And there's a cutoff for most land uses. I want to say 10, but I'd have to take a look at the code. We don't have a lot of late night operations, and we also so that's for uses that are either permitted by right or otherwise. It's only when alcohol is introduced that the conditional use permit is required. And in those instances, because there could be bottles clinging and things like that, we do impose additional conditions on that. We may require the trash not to be taken out at night, for instance, and have it be done in the morning. So they have to store that on site. Those are things that we can look at when we do require a conditional use permit for alcohol.
Okay, as long as that's something that is kind of given consideration, I don't have an issue with, looking at CUPs and not having that imposed, but we do want to be careful that it doesn't spill over into other complaints and so forth.
So just on that point, and maybe drawing on one of our recommendations that I was suggesting be merged. One of our recommendations has to do with creating more objective standards for conditional use permits. And another way that we could look at that is to develop those type of objective standards that would address those situations, particularly if the committee and the ad hoc were interested in maybe not, requiring a CUP for beer and wine or something like that. We would then replace that with objective standards, and we could do that through possibly through a near-term action if that were the direction.
And just one point there that I think would be helpful if we continue this discussion on feedback from the committee is if the alcohol is ancillary to the use, like a restaurant that serves beer and wine, do we want to address that through objective standards versus if it is non-ancillary and a primary use, like a bar where, they're generally serving the alcohol as kind of the pitch, do you still want a CUP applied in that case? So there's different ways to explore that. And so if we get to the discussion portion of the conversation today, and that's something the committee wants to explore, we can hash through that a little bit more.
I think that that's a good point, and it would be beneficial for us to understand the pros and cons on both. On the formula retail, so how did you go from 10 to 50? I mean, I see in notes somewhere it says that, looking at the US. So how is the US look applied to Palo Alto, and why are we looking at US versus what is right in Palo Alto? What would be the right ratio for Palo Alto?
So the threshold of 10 or 50 is takes a look at national brands, and if you have more than 10 of those types of businesses across the nation, that's when we would say you need a conditional use permit.
Oh,
So the threshold of raising that to 50 just means if you've got 49 of those brands nationally, then you could enter the Palo Alto market without a conditional use permit.
okay. But 50 is still a number that we should be kind of considering. It could be less, but no more.
It could be any number that you want.
So John, might be helpful to if you could describe the PTC discussion on that point. Of what is that number? Is it 10? Is it 50? And the rationale?
Right.
For one versus the other.
So this is where I might ask Mr. Weary to come in. It was the consultant recommendation to go to 50. And I think the idea was there's actually two parts to this recommendation. Actually, there are two parts to the recommendation, but there's another component where the recommendation from the consultant also talks about just looking at the California market as opposed to the United States. And so if you just look at the California market, you're going to allow for more uses to come in without the need of a conditional use permit. If you look at the entirety of the United States, there might be a lot of uses on the East Coast or elsewhere in the nation that want to break out to the West Coast. But if they trip that threshold, they may require a conditional use permit. And as we know, conditional use permits can be a barrier to some new uses being established. As to the specific recommendation of 50, Dan, can you elaborate on that recommendation? And,
Sure.
and to the extent that you recall the PTC deliberation.
Yeah, there's been quite a few deliberations. So I don't know if I could be that specific, but we talked about a number of different numbers, and I think that number of 50 might have come from some of the other examples that we evaluated when we were going through our analyses. So we did look at other kind of peer cities and examples and what thresholds they've used. For example, Santa Monica uses 150. City of Coronado limits to restaurants like Santa Monica does. They use 15. Palo Alto is currently 10. So I think that was kind of somewhat just kind of a negotiated level. I don't think there was any particular magic about 50 or versus 60 or 45. I think it was just kind of a comfort that was assumed there. The other item, Jonathan, that you alluded to is something that we brought up is that is nationwide. So if you think 50 nationwide, one per state, the issue we thought is, well, maybe we limit to California. That would be more permissive. And again, the concern is, well, try to get at what are you concerned about with 50 versus 10 or 150? Is it seeing too many of these and recognition of a use? Is that harmful? In some cases, that's helpful. You think about Starbucks, people have that brand, they understand what they're going to get. That drives a lot of traffic, not only to Starbucks, to the surrounding area. So sometimes these formula uses are very positive additions and contributors to the overall health of an area. So part of that is just trying to find an appropriate balance. And I think the 50 came from really just kind of a comfort level with the PTC, that was, kind of that Goldilocks, not too high, not too low, or at least it was a reasonable, a reasonable step from where you currently are at 10.
Thank you. That helps. I'm sorry. But so one of the things, be it 50 or in between or 10, definitely more than 10. I do think that formula retail is something that we have to look at and increase a bit, just so that we can have the anchors in our business districts. But also it is a balance that we do have to look at, simply because that potentially can be difficult for mom and pops to get into that district. That could cause prices to increase. And so we want to have a balance of small businesses, small retail, along with the formula retail. So thank you for helping me clarify and understand that 50 number and why we looked at a national versus regionally or locally or statewide. Okay. Do you have anything else to ask? No. Okay. In that case, then let's go to public comments. Mr. Sam.
Our first speaker will be Brad E.
Thank you. I'm here today just to say that I generally support the PTC's recommendations. There's a few things that I just want to understand or clarify. What I don't understand is why we would want to limit national restaurants on Cal Ave. While most of our tenants are mom pop, we should be welcoming pretty much who wants to come in. And as Michael Baker just alluded to, these national restaurants are a big driver of traffic. We just had a major retailer of Cal Ave just leave, Starbucks. We may not like their coffee, but they help drive foot traffic. And I don't know if we should be welcoming anybody who wants to come in. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a single formula retail applicant, and that's just like another barrier to entry. Realtor preservation has been a massive failure. I would say let's just go back to the 2009 zoning ordinance that really allowed us to protect the downtown cores, give flexibility to the side streets, to provide that flexibility for our downtown to adjust to what the market demands are. I understand that we brought up the in lieu fees on Cal Ave with regards to the change of use. I do want to point out that the parking assessment district is still in the code, even though we have paid off the garage bonds. The parking assessment district allows us to pay for maintenance, street cleaning, a lot of things in the downtown enjoys, like the twinkle lights and downtown streets team, TMA. So we really should be looking at assessing that district and then allowing for those fees to be charged. CUP is another failure. Most tenants who hear their use requires a CUP immediately runs for the hills. It's just a massive barrier to entry. A good example was Pete's Coffee wanted to come into Cal Ave. When they heard the formula retail required a CUP application or formula retail application, they left. With any other CUPs, they just, whenever someone hears it, they don't want to come. I think it's important to realize that these retailers are our customers. So, let's streamline the process. Let's simplify the code, broaden the definition of retail uses, reduce these barriers like the CUPs and the national restaurant bans, give staff discretion to make decisions, and finally put our retail on a path to succeed. Thank you.
Our next speaker is John S.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Chair Koo. Good morning, council members. John Shank with Thwaites Brothers. Have been having this discussion for a really long time. And I'm very happy so much has happened through the PTC process with staff. This report, 120-page PDF, great reading. I think my hope is, one, that during this even, I know it's a public hearing, we're Brown Act and we got the clock running. There's people here. The informality, if there's a way that as you guys are discussing to ask questions, I'm volunteering. I'm happy to help participate or lend a perspective. And it's for retail, it is critical to have sufficient parking. Easily accessible, safe, proximate to the retailers. So that what we have today is pretty doggone good. If we look at where all the parking is, there was a graphic somewhere, well distributed. It's almost every block. There's public parking somewhere. Super important. I also want to say, because I've read and I've heard through many of the other committee meetings and such, there's an impression that we have extra parking. We have no extra parking. Amazon came out this week, 5 days a week back in the office. We had no extra parking 5 years ago. City was going to move forward with a garage as the result of all the previous studies and reports because we needed parking. We were short. We're going to be short again when we're filled, and it's going to happen. So these plans that we're making are not for today when there's some excess parking because work from home still is prevalent and the office tenants haven't right-sized themselves to fill the vacant spaces that are left by the work from home folks. I also want to point out the street parking. It's probably the most valuable parking to all retailers because it's close, it's easy. Customers perceive, hey, by the way, at Thwaites Brothers, we have more than 20 more retail tenants than office tenants. I've got more than 20 retailers in the downtown. More than half, maybe 3/4 are non-food retailers. They need the street parking. They don't want a parklet in front of their store. It's death to them. The idea that a restaurant can put a parklet in front of them without they're okay, or they have to build their own, spend $100,000. They can't. We've got women's clothing retailer who's out there just scared to death to extend a lease for fear he's going to either have to spend $100,000 to build a parklet per your standards to use for what, or have a neighbor retailer there, the customers, the dirt, the filth, it's a horrible policy and it's scary to retailers that I think we're trying to support. Parking, parking, parking. Anyway, I could go on for days, but my time is up. Thanks.
So I want to ask about the implications of AB 2097 going forward, which means that if new development, whether it be office, retail, or housing, cannot have any parking requirement either directly or the in lieu, is that correct as well?
Yeah, because I don't think it could be. Served as well.
Oops, sorry, I had my mic
Sorry,
off.
thank you. I think you're spot on. In the long run, I'm concerned as well, because it means we end up without parking. And as I also love office, because the office, as you may recall, your own study, I think it was in 2020, or was COVID was starting, or maybe 2021 by the time we did it, or you guys did it. 70–80% of retail sales were from the daytime population, the workers, the student. It was that group. It wasn't residents in the neighboring communities, even just neighborhoods. It was the office folks. There's not a lot of development in the downtown. There just isn't, right? It just is. I think we build a building 2 or 3 a decade sort of thing in the downtown. So I'm not super worried like it's going to happen tomorrow. We're not Redwood City, we're not Mountain View. But the idea that very quickly we could further burden the strains on parking that I'm pointing out exist today is worrisome. I think it becomes I'm going to say city. We're all part of the city. We're all paying the taxes. We do our things. I think it becomes the community's issue. We have to build a garage to the degree there's all this development that impairs our retail. I think the retail's the lifeblood. That's why I'm excited about all that's happening here. It's what the residents want to see. It's what will bring people to our hotels. It's what'll bring the office folks back, because the employees will want to be in this vibrant environment, and it becomes this great cycle. And today, the office folks and the hotel visitors aren't there, so the retailers aren't doing great. They want to see these people, but they want the retail back. It's tough, but in the longer run, I think we're going to have to build a garage.
Well, and
Or a garage
just
is.
say that whereas we may not have a lot of office development on the horizon downtown, I expect once we have our new housing plan for downtown, we will see a significant amount of housing, and it has similar exemptions. So that's my real concern there.
Yeah, I differ a bit on that. As much as we're big supporters of housing. I'd love to see housing. I still don't think, at least in the downtown, we're going to see a lot of housing because of the size of our the sites. That it's very difficult in the downtown to see
I
much.
appreciate lot combining would need to occur
Yeah.
in most circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And again, ask us questions, please.
Our next speaker is Charlie W.
Good morning, and thank you for being here this morning, and thanks for staff for this report. I was looking at my notes. It was a year ago when I spoke to council and asked you to support the recommendations provided by Street Sense for the economic development strategy to increase the economic vitality. So our points back then were to invest in redesigning University Avenue, to define it as a destination point, to streamline and update or remove unnecessary use restrictions. We particularly agreed that the change in the work patterns and shopping patterns should warrant revisiting the zoning codes, and we asked you to look at more flexible zoning codes and structures. So here we are this morning, and we still agree with that, and we support the recommendations from the staff report, particularly around relaxing formula retail restrictions to allow businesses that will increase shoppers, especially on Cal Ave, with experiences and with personal experiences that they can't get with an online experience, to allow certain non-retail use that would allow, again, to attract people to come in person, indoor recreation. I've even heard of pet care services being an option where people can come in and be on the street or be in downtown for more than just a one-stop shop, and then to expand the definition of what's allowable to increase shoppers again for a better experience and a better time spent on the street. So overall, I think what we support in this staff report is the recommendations that can allow our guests, our residents to come in and have more experiences, more businesses that create that experience. And as the work patterns are changing, as shopping patterns are changing, how can revisions be made to support those changes? So thank you.
Our next speaker is Roxy R.
Thank you and good morning. I should have notes, but I didn't take notes. I'm gonna talk from my head. As I've been saying for a long time, retail is changing, and Amazon is bigger than ever. Shopping on the internet is bigger than ever. And retail is changing, and it's going to keep changing the rest of our lives. It just changes. Like we don't have any more waterbed stores and places that you jump up and down on outdoors, jumping things and things like that, which used to be a big thing. And I think we're missing in Palo Alto is flexibility. And I'm going to give you two examples. Or one example for sure. I had a national tenant come and see me. It's called Solid Core. And I saw Steve about it, and I made a presentation to him, and he took it to higher up in the city. And I thought I was going to go through, but it didn't. I got it turned down. And it was a company that brings tons of customers in, especially probably 70 to 70% women, and the rest are men. And those customers come in for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, and they would support other retailers. They go to the coffee shop, they go to the workout store, they go buy a pair of shoes. And I think we need to be flexible because it's not pure retail. It was a machine that you work on to make your stomachs more solid and your whole body more flexible. And but it's a retail thing. They sell sweatshirts and everything else. But more importantly, this particular Solid Core business would support other retailers and make our shopping downtown more solid. And that's why I'm saying we need to be more flexible and just can't say it has to be retail to buy a pair of shoes or buy a dress or have a cash register to ring up sales. So that's number one. And number two is your report that you did on the retail thing. I read it's long. I have to reread it again. But I think why you didn't include Stanford into the retail core, because it's a big thing. And I'm going to get to that 1 second because we just lost something to Stanford. But
Sir, your time is up.
Okay, I have just a minute more. Thank you. I have just a minute more. I agree with you that we should have included Burlingame in our sales. It's very important. They're really hurting areas like downtown Palo Alto. They're taking traffic away from us because they look so fantastic. The one thing I want to say that we lost was I had a national firm called New Balance shoes, fabulous shoes. They wanted to open up a store downtown. Then The head guy from New Balance is walking the streets. He says, I don't want to open up downtown. I want to go to Stanford. And what was his reason to do that? I talked to him personally on this, is he didn't want to have a parklet in front of him. And that's what he wanted, customers to be able to park their car and come into a store and not have a food service in front of them. And that's why he went to Stanford. That was his only reason. He was looking at downtown.
Thank you, Roxy.
Our next speaker is Joshua S.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak here today. Really wanted to first and foremost start out by thanking the City of Palo Alto and city staff for the outreach and what you're doing right now. I think that the focus on retail and prioritizing the vision for retail's future in Palo Alto is a critical piece, and the work done to date is important. And I do think that the city, what I have seen as of late is really making a good push to ensure that that tenants and folks know that Palo Alto is open for business. Burlingame was mentioned early on in this process. In Burlingame, we've done a recent survey of retail vacancy, and it's around 2% right now. Per CoStar and per the data available. Palo Alto has always been a very kind of key and pivotal element of any retailer's rollout in Northern California, specifically the Bay Area market. Palo Alto, obviously the affluence, the density, Stanford adjacency, all these components become mission critical. And I think that really what all of the speakers prior to myself have said that I wholeheartedly agree with is that the accessibility into this downtown core via parking, via kind of pedestrian elements, via all these things that we're talking about are critical items for the success and future success of Palo Alto's retail core. I think this study, while it is much broader than University Avenue, to be sure, and I agree with AB 2097 in many cases, especially for areas that are not in the downtown core that are otherwise impacted by limited parking or more non-traditional parking scenarios. I do think that having a downtown core that is easily accessible and easily walkable is critical. Going along beyond that component, I do agree with the idea of enhancing and expanding retail uses. Retailers, as they look in the market, and I am a commercial broker, by trade, and we are working solely with retail tenants, retail landlords, and on the leasing and sale of retail properties. Certainty becomes the critical path item. I think, as Roxy mentioned, prior to myself, if Parklet can go in front of a space, if that accessibility and parking becomes in question, a retailer is going to find an alternative that's going to fit that bill. So I think in this case, really, looking at how do we ensure a retailer is comfortable, confident that their use would be approved, accepted, that they're going to be able to put good energy after a space that is going to be actionable for them. Part of that is the CUP component, as mentioned. Really adding CUPs, this is something that is ultimately, in my mind, a no-go if it's not necessary, because that is something that is going to cause uncertainty for a retailer and ultimately is going to cause them to look for alternatives where they can have that certainty in the marketplace. Happy to continue, but I know my time is up.
That concludes our speakers for this item.
Thank you, Samuel. Okay, we'll bring it back to the committee for comments. And I do want to include, take up John's suggestion if we have questions that we also include them. I think a lot of the comments that were provided really is helpful for us, hearing from people that are boots on the ground and who deals with this a lot. So thank you. And, the suggestion that Burlingame should be included, I do agree. Now, I think one of the things that we want to look at, how do we differentiate ourselves from Stanford and Town and Country, because, those are the other retail areas and restaurant areas that in a way we're competing with. So that's something that we should be considering as well. But anyway, bringing it back to the committee. Do you have anything, comments?
Yeah. So first on that Burlingame comparison, on the one hand, they've done a good job in a lot of ways, but the point that there is an apples and oranges comparison there. They don't have Stanford Shopping Center in Town and Country, which is where the high-end national chains have gone. And if you go to Burlingame, those retailers that are in Palo Alto at Stanford and Town and Country, you see many of them on their main street in Burlingame. That doesn't mean we give up on trying to make ourselves in our downtowns more appealing for them, but we have to recognize that that's a distinction when we try to make that comparison. We have a couple of questions before us. One is the first one on the interchangeability, recommendation number 1. And And part of that is which of these things would go on an urgency ordinance versus taking a longer period of time. I would love to be able to move forward with that because I do think that uncertainty in the CUP is a barrier to those no retailers. I don't think that we have thought through well enough what this will mean longer term with AB 2097 in the parking. So you combine that with other ramifications of 2097. And so for that reason, I wouldn't support including that in the urgency ordinance and instead refer it back to try to have some better analysis and reconciliation of those tensions. I don't want to take forever. I think it's important, but I just don't think we've come to think this through. It's the ramifications of 2097 are new and profound potentially. So that would be my recommendation there. I do think that staff recommendations 2 and 3 could go forward on the urgency ordinance. On 4, we haven't gotten any clarification on that boundary, whether the interpretation, I don't even know in this recommendation, maybe John, you can answer. Is it based upon the definition of distance from the transit station being the boarding area or from the furthest edge of any transit area properties?
The way that we're currently applying AB 2097 is from a point that approximates the a discrete location on the platform, and then we go a half mile from that radius.
So it's basically the boarding area.
Yes. And this note on, or this recommendation on number 4, based on how we've drawn that radius, there are 16 properties that are in the downtown that are just not included. And this recommendation would be to extend it to those 16. But again, this is something that the city council discussed when it had the NVCAP conversation. So this can be addressed in October when we're before the council again seeking direction on how to proceed on these.
Okay. And at that time, the consensus of the council was we aren't fans of how the blunt instrument of 2097. So do we really want to go further than its requirements? Okay. And then on the issue of the boundaries of the retail preservation ordinance and just I think there are several different things we want to actually try to resolve. One is how we liberalize uses and where. And we've talked about kind of the areas that are outside of the retail districts that would otherwise be protected. And I think that's one important distinction is how we liberalize that, whether we liberalize uses or whether we eliminate restrictions on use. And I think that there are certain geographic areas where I could be convinced to eliminate them in a careful way, and others where I wouldn't want to have it go to general office, but would be open to having it go to services that are not currently permitted under the retail ordinance. So, medical office and those kinds of services as opposed to tech companies. Then within the core retail areas, there's a separate issue that was spoken about as, what if we liberalize uses that are not requiring a conditional use permit? Do we do that on Main Street as well as the side streets? So in the downtown area, do we have that we allow any of those kinds of gyms and whatever without a CUP on University and Cal Ave, for instance, versus on perpendicular or side streets that are not the core retail area? And I still think that that's where we want to concentrate core retail activity, and then these other more liberalized uses can be in the adjacent areas. But I haven't seen that come forward with that kind of recommendation, and that's what I continue to look for. So I think those are my primary comments, which leave that the recommendation number 2 could go forward in my mind on the urgency, and number 3, I'm not sure that it's fleshed out well enough yet. I'd be inclined to include it, but is it correct? I see that this says 6 and 1 in favor. At first, the amend is in parentheses, but the vote from PTC was in favor of amending. I would reverse those in the presentation of the council because it almost implies that repeal is the recommendation. And second, didn't PTC actually have one vote on repeal that was a 4-3? And 3 members favored complete repeal, and then this was a subsequent vote after that failed?
Yeah, this was the subsequent action. We just reported out on the one that was actionable.
Yeah, I'll just say that I was very surprised that 3 planning commissioners voted to completely repeal. And that's not consistent with prior council direction, because we've given some direction on this, and we're receptive to significant amendments, both geographically and by use, but not the complete repeal has been the consensus, I've thought.
I was going to suggest that if, as you narrow in toward a recommendation, that if you wanted to provide those general parameters, I think that may be helpful to staff. So for example, if it is to limit geographically and with any specificity that the committee wants to put in front of the full council.
Okay, well then, when we come to the motion, I'll try to articulate something along those lines.
So just as a process question, so there's the recommendation option of doing the urgency ordinance where it goes straight to council and on a consent.
Well, just perhaps to clarify on that,
Yeah.
because I could see how that could be confusing. What we're looking for today is a recommendation to council, and that recommendation would be what's the next step? And is that next step to proceed with the urgency ordinance, which would have it go directly back to council, versus on the perhaps other end of the spectrum, a referral back to staff and PTC to develop a more robust process before bringing it back to full council?
So the way I look at it is that there are certain things that we can put on the urgency and that it can go straight to council. But there are others that I think needs a more robust discussion. Certainly some of the things that Pat and I both said, that needs to be examined a little bit more, especially with the geographic location of retail and retail, even to the definition of what retail and retail like is. But certainly and also parking, right? So So is that something that the committee is agreeable to, that between items 1 to 15, we can pick certain items that is urgency and then others going through the robust discussion? Pat? Yeah, okay. So why don't we go ahead with picking which ones are the urgency ones that can move quickly along. Pat has already mentioned 2. I agree with that. And that would just be limited to restaurants at this point, and what about the retail component?
So the recommendation is to raise the threshold from 10 to 50 and have it only apply to restaurants, formula restaurants. And there's an outstanding question of whether or not you want that to be 50 nationwide or 50 just in California.
And clarification, I think as the chair was asking, for retailers, there would be no limit.
Is there no limits for retailers?
There would be no CUP requirement for formula retailers.
Okay, so, but then again, that would also still determine on whether it's going to be on the main street or the side streets where, for example, if you have a gym taking up space on the main street university, is that going to be a consideration, or is that?
So this recommendation number 2 only applies to the California Avenue area.
Oh,
That's the only area in town that we have a formula retail restriction.
okay.
And if we adjust it as recommended, if you had a national gym that wanted to locate on California Avenue, barring any other restrictions about gym uses, and I'd have to take a look at our code on that because there is some restrictions on that. But if there was a retailer that was allowed on California Avenue that was national, a national brand, that would be allowed to locate. If it was a national restaurant they had more than 50 shops, either in California or nationwide, subject to the committee's recommendation, then that would require a conditional use permit.
Okay, so number 2, relaxed formula retail restrictions is only California Avenue.
Yeah, the California Avenue area. I'm not exactly sure if it's just California Avenue or if it extends to some of the adjacent
And
streets.
can we get a clarification? The current restriction doesn't say we don't allow them. I thought it capped them.
It requires a conditional use permit. So if they have more than 10 locations, they have to go through the conditional use permit process to site there.
Oh, it wasn't a limit on the number.
Right.
No.
So
Okay.
and this is the example that one of the brokers gave of Eats with more than 10 locations. They would have had to fill out a CUP. That uncertainty prevented them from citing there and they moved on.
Okay, so I would say we put number 2 as an urgency, unless there's any further comments.
Well, the only clarification or distinction that I would want to make to that is that I'm good with that for goods retailers. I'm good with it for the restaurants and that it be the California 50. I have concerns on the proliferation of exercise uses. We're getting more and more. We have to balance it against. We don't want vacancies, but it's really expanding extensively in recent years. And I'm not sure that I would want to allow these big chains of gyms to further basically compete with other uses that belong more on the main street. I'd be fine with opening it up on the side streets, but not on Cal Ave. So I don't know how we would carve that out. I guess just to say to approve that alternative, change it to the California limit for restaurants on 50, but exclude formula exercise businesses on Cal Ave itself from the current requirements. I'm trying to recall what the current requirements are, and John kind of alluded to that.
Yeah, I think we hear the feedback. We kind of understand the general intent. If that's the will of the committee, we can certainly work to incorporate that as we return to council.
I don't know whether that is, my colleagues agree or not.
Yeah, I do agree with that. So there is, number 8 says there's the 1,800 square feet limit before the CUP comes in place, and the staff is recommending for it to increase to 3,000 square feet before a CUP is needed. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct.
So if we simply held off on 8, then it really doesn't allow right now those big chains for the most part, because they're bigger than that. Yeah, 24-hour fitness type of company. They don't operate in 1,800 square feet.
Concept. It can, I think that
Well,
we,
I guess I will say that I continue to be concerned with proliferation of gyms on Cal Ave versus I'm perfectly fine with all the surrounding streets.
all right. So, shall we take a vote on 2?
Sure.
So we can take a vote on 2 with the criteria that, Pat put forward. And we can put that as an urgency. Do you need a vote?
Yes.
Yeah, we can just,
formal recommendation.
yeah, we can just straw vote ourselves. We don't have to go through the clerk, I think.
So on 2 straw vote. Okay, so that's,
All in favor?
So Chair Koo,
yes.
so my recommendation would be if you're going to go through the list, maybe the clerk can help kind of record what happened so that she can eventually draft a full motion that you can then formally approve everything all at once.
So
at
we
the
want
end.
to announce the vote out loud, even if we're speeding it up through the straw. 3-0 in favor.
That's good.
Is that, can Samuel?
Yep.
Christine?
Item number 2, 3-0 vote.
3-0
Yeah.
vote, and it's basically using the California model for goods and restaurants, okay. But to keep the CUP for 1,800 square feet, or
So what I understood is that we would raise the formula retail threshold from 10 to 50. That 50 would be based on the number of businesses, formula retail businesses that are in California. And we're looking to exclude gyms on California Avenue from being able to avail itself to that provision.
Perhaps just to clarify, I think that second part, John, wasn't exactly what the committee discussed, but maybe worth considering. So again, separate part 2. Part 2, you said go with that 50 within California. Before you move on, going back to item number 8, hearing the committee's feedback, I think what John was just suggesting is one approach could be to raise the CUP threshold, but exclude gyms from that higher threshold or something along those lines.
Yeah, and my approach would be I'd be open to it on the side and parallel and perpendicular streets. I wouldn't be open to it on Cal Ave.
So perhaps exclude gyms directly on Cal Ave from that higher threshold.
Yeah. Oh, so then in that case, we could endorse 8.
Yep.
But
yes,
with the exclusion of Cal Ave itself.
Exactly.
Okay, I would
I would agree to that, to straw poll 2 and 8,
favor.
2 and
Okay.
8, yes.
You want to announce your straw polls every time.
It's so
They're working on it.
they're having a consultation right now. Yeah.
But if either way, if the chair just each time we both announce.
Okay, so on
Pass
this
unanimous.
vote is unanimous for 2 and 8,
With 8
With 8.
excluding Cal Ave.
excluding Cal Ave, yeah.
Or excluding gyms on Cal Ave.
Right. Oh, was there something else in 8?
I think the
So-
8, just as they're working to
Oh,
wrap it all up, I just want to package this all so we're all clear about what we're talking about. So 2 is being endorsed with the California 50 for restaurants. 8 is being endorsed, but excluding gyms on Cal Ave proper.
Got it.
Right.
And
So on 8, it says commercial recreation. So we want to make sure that that's understood as gyms and.
was
We're using those two terms synonymously, right?
Well, we should distinguish that because we do define commercial recreation, which could include other items beyond gyms. And so what I'm hearing though is the fitness studios and gyms are the part that we want to exclude.
Okay.
Yes.
So other commercial recreation uses would be allowed, just not the gyms, et cetera. Is that correct? And they'd still be allowed up to 1,800.
And maybe it'd be helpful if I provide a definition for commercial recreation. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is from our code. Commercial recreation means a use providing recreation, amusement, exercise, or entertainment services, including theaters, bowling lanes, billiard parlors, skating arenas, gymnasiums, exercise studios or facilities, fitness centers, martial arts studios, group movement instruction, and similar services operated on a private or for-profit
Okay,
basis.
yeah, so there's certainly some
Some things. that
commercial,
don't-
some recreation that we definitely would want to encourage. Okay, great, thank you.
Could we ask for some clarification? That might be more helpful now that it's on the screen.
Gotta blow it up. Okay, so were you going to put something in there?
Gotta separate the gyms part.
So gyms and then B, yeah, there you go.
We got B is going to be number 8.
So
From number 8. So we are approving recommendation number 8, except the following. Is that right?
and once Christine's
Mhm.
ready, perhaps we need to remove from item A, everything after and excluding. Because that's really related to
The next
B.
one.
Mhm.
Yeah. I got it.
Yeah, I would just add, but excluding gyms directly on California Avenue, because there's more to 8.
A,
On
B.
1B, recommendation 8, but excluding gyms directly on California Avenue.
Gyms are also exercise places, right? When you read the definition. So
Yeah,
gyms
so
are,
this is,
gyms are like elliptical machines.
I will point out that this is staff receiving feedback from the retail committee and will be returning to council with the actual pieces of this.
Language.
We will return with the technical and formal language as part of that. We are hearing the message that you are transmitting and we will incorporate that as we go forward. We could spend a lot of time getting into the exact particulars of it, but I think we understand the intent here.
Okay, and I can leave that. It's just that it's going to the consent calendar, right? This urgency ordinance.
No,
No. good.
the
Okay.
the approach that the ad hoc wants to take will be communicated to the council on consent, and barring that being pulled off consent, we would proceed in that manner, which means then preparing the ordinance, drafting the language.
and then coming back to the full council with the urgency ordinance itself. So that'll be a second step after the consent item.
So you'll have another bite at the apple to sort of look at the specific language that you
And
don't
for the
have
council
before you.
to have input, okay. Because if it's going just onto consent, I mean, want to sure. we understand.
If there's agreement of the committee, that's what's going to consent, and then the actual action of adopting the ordinance, interim, urgency, or otherwise, would just go straight to the council as a action item discussion.
Okay,
I would just call the clerk's attention. It looks like Dan has his hand up.
oh, yeah.
Yeah. Not to complicate it, I think, Steve, you make a good point, which is you need to get the recommendations to city council, but just to clarify that the definition that Jonathan read about commercial recreation is inclusive of those exercise studios and fitness. I think you heard that. Just to clarify, the use schedule is where there's an existing restriction limiting beauty shops, nail salons, barber shops, fitness studios, and small learning centers, specifically to 1,800 square feet. So that was the little tweak that was recommended to change, is to follow industry standard, allow that to follow the typical size, which is an average of about 3,000 square feet. So it doesn't necessarily have to change commercial recreation. It could just change that one CUP footnote in your use tables or in your use regulations. I think if we get the intent, we can work on exactly where those changes are going to occur. But it doesn't, what you're doing doesn't have to change commercial recreation on all of those uses. It currently, the recommendation that was proposed was to change that one threshold for the CUP specifically for those fitness exercise type uses.
Yep. So we'll reflect that in the second step, which will be that urgency ordinance.
Okay.
That probably didn't help. Sorry.
And then on things that we're not recommending for the urgency ordinance, you still want
Direction.
the committee to make.
Yes,
Forward.
because that will go presumably, and again, it's subject to committee's recommendation, but presumably would take the more.
Okay, so on
Extended
recommendation number
process.
1, which is, I would recommend that staff return with legal and analysis of the legal prerogatives and long-term ramifications on parking of the interchangeability. And then I would add to that to explore a variation of interchangeability that would require some form of in lieu parking payment for as a condition of interchangeability.
Can we combine that with further review with item 4?
Well, I was going to hit that next under parking, but
But you want to keep it separate?
Yeah, just for
Okay.
this, but because they're kind of two separate things. And I'll just comment that I do want to liberalize the interchangeability, but I'm concerned about a carte blanche alleviation of not only, certainly we don't want the on-street parking, but no mechanism to provide for parking if we're drastically increasing demand over time, which is something that's part of a retail trend, which is toward greater food and beverage and less goods. But I don't know that know what that sweet spot is and what we can and can't do under AB 2097.
And maybe just to footnote that downtown, all of the uses are already blended. So this doesn't really have applicability downtown because everything's a 1 to 250 use or 1 to 200 use downtown. For California Avenue, I would say irrespective of the analysis and study, AB 2097 will still apply in those areas. And so whether we make any changes it's not going to have an effect for California Avenue. So what we're really talking about are areas that are principally located on El Camino Real and Middlefield.
Actually, one of the things I was getting at is right now, if you have a change of use and we have our current, a conditional use permit for change of use. And if somebody goes to a higher density parking, we aren't obligated to provide that. and therefore we wouldn't have an increase in the parking demand if we didn't allow for the change of use. Whereas if we make the change of use permitted and not a conditional use, then they can do it, and the parking ramifications, they don't have any obligation to mitigate those.
So you would have uses that require greater parking and are under our code today to have a CUP requirement.
Well, I don't know whether it would be CUP. I want to explore whether we can have something that says, we'll give you that, but only under the condition that you pay an in lieu of some form. And I'm not assuming it would be necessarily the full cost of an in lieu parking space. But once we give it by right, we lose the prerogative to have them mitigate the parking impact.
Yeah, I don't know that I understand that interest. I don't know that is something that we can do.
I know that, and that's why I'm only referring to not to act on it, but to ask for that analysis.
Right.
When I think that's part and parcel of what we come back with on 2097.
Okay. So that's none of us know the answers right now. I'm trying to frame a problem, and that we try to get closer to understanding what we can and can't do, and to think through the ramifications.
And so one is not going to be an urgency. It's going to
Correct.
Require returning.
I'd like to add on to one, a referral to evaluate reactivation of the Calab Parking Assessment District. And then intent would be at a minimum to look at how it could help maintain that area, as I think Brad spoke about.
So just a point of clarity, Brady Heekeen was speaking about the downtown University Ave parking assessment district.
I don't think so.
Right.
Okay.
I think he was referring to
Okay.
Calab, which we've talked about, but
Right.
it's
And
longer conversation.
I think both should be returned, but definitely if we're talking about California Avenue right now, then that one should also be brought back.
Okay.
Okay, so can we take a straw poll on this? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. That was 3-0.
Goes 3-0.
And then on number 4, I would move that we do not recommend inclusion of the 16 parcels that are outside of the AB 2097 boundaries, as we understand the boundaries.
I second that. Can we take a straw? Okay. So for number 4, all approve?
Yes.
Okay, also unanimous. Number 4.
Goes 3-0.
3-0. Number 5. Yes.
We do 3.
Oh.
Did we?
Did we do 3? No, we didn't do 3.
That gets complicated.
I wouldn't put it in the urgency, but definitely to return. You say 6 months.
So is the committee interested in looking at opportunities to amend the retail preservation ordinance? If so, we could accept that direction, and that will follow the 18-month schedule that we've laid out for a midterm action.
Okay.
So I would recommend that we amend the retail preservation ordinance, and that we evaluate the geographic boundaries for its application. And the permitted uses for what remains within the geographic the amended geographic boundaries. I guess that covers it because we've covered in the downtowns, the other.
And this is citywide, or is it just a GFNR combining this?
This has no
Outside
change.
GFNR.
This has no
Outside,
change to
okay.
GFR. And I will say, the permitted uses is also captured in recommendation 7. So whatever happens in recommendation 7, we would anticipate have a direct relationship to the permitted uses allowed for this RPO area.
So do we combine 3 and 7 together?
No, you don't
No.
need to. So the recommendations, I understand it is, yes, let's look at amending the retail preservation area, including evaluating its geographic applicability, and what uses may be authorized under that ordinance. And that would be a midterm item that we would include into next year's work plan and schedule.
Will it?
I guess I have a question. Are there any aspects of this that we think we could accelerate? And rather than try and take it all as one big bite?
For retail preservation?
Yes.
But we may not need all of the 18 months, but we
So I
would.
guess let me put into the motion a recommendation to, if possible, partition this to whatever portions can be implemented sooner.
So Steve's reminding me, recommendation 7, if the committee endorses that, would have a meaningful effect on this recommendation as well within the 6-month timeframe.
Whether it's in the same. Okay, so we got 2B. Is that our next vote? We haven't voted right on that.
So so I see number 7 has been added to B.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so Christine, would you keep number 7 separate?
7 down under C.
Yeah, uh-huh. And 3 and 7 is gonna go through vetting through the PTC, right? Is it gonna go around to the PTC or is it not?
I think that's a bit of a question of just what the process we want to proceed with on those. So we're kind of tiering this list out into how we want to proceed. There are the things that we want to proceed very quickly with. Those are in 1. And then as we tier the next group, it would be a discussion of how do we want to proceed with those? Do we want to go back?
I do think 3 and 7, looking at the ordinance and the codes and so forth, it should go through PTC for a dive review. Your thoughts?
I was just gonna note that as we talked about earlier, you've got sort of the bracket of options from urgency ordinance to robust process. And if there's something in between that might apply, I think that would also be worthy of trying to clarify. Perhaps number 7 fits in that category.
Yes, 7 and 3, I believe 7 and 3 both fit into the category of having a deep dive by the Planning and Transportation Commissioners.
And how deep have they already done that?
Yeah, so what we're looking for here is support to make a change. And what we would that's the big part, right? And now the details are what we need to figure out. How do we write it in a way that adds clarity and achieves our goal?
Okay,
so it's just the draft.
On 2B?
No, not
Let's
yet.
do that and then focus on 7.
All right, all that approve 2B,
Yes.
and that's also 3-0.
Okay. So on 7, I support that and trying to accelerate it and as soon as possible.
Perhaps, John, you could share your thoughts on what accelerated might look like.
Sure. So for number 1, that's going that would just go straight to council, item number 1 for consideration on action. Item 2, is one that would follow, once we receive direction, we would start the work and we would go have hearings before the Planning and Transportation Commission before coming to the city council for an action item on that discussion.
So, and the amount of discussion and recommendation by the planning commission to date on 2C, number 7 is what?
We have a conceptual approach on how we would do that. I wouldn't characterize it as a deep dive, but it's because they've done a lot of work on that. So now we're just trying to figure out how to apply it.
Okay.
And this would be within that 6-month window.
Okay.
6 versus 18. Let me just clarify.
For item 7 and for portions of 2B, because that'll be addressed under recommendation 7. The geographic boundaries, we'll see if we can make that happen in the same time frame, but that it may require a little more
Yeah,
discussion.
I just, whatever portion of this can get to us sooner, great.
Lydia, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm struggling with why 2B and C related to the retail preservation ordinance and expanding definitions. Why are we not putting that up in the urgency ordinance?
They haven't been fleshed out.
I know that we're concerned about AB 2097 parking stuff, and we've got that in 2A.
But there are no recommendations on yet from PTC or staff on specifically what would be the changes in 2B and 2C.
Because the question that PTC came back with was whether we should repeal or amend. And so right now we're recommending to council it's an amendment. And then they're gonna.
Yeah, they have to, what would those amendments be? They've had discussions about them conceptually, but they don't have specific recommendations, nor do staff at this time.
Dan Weary has his hand up again. I wonder if he might have some thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully this is a clarification. There was recommendation 7 had 2 parts. The first part, I believe PTC recommended, I think it might have been unanimous or 6-1. That was to amend the definition of retail light, which is 125.1 in the zoning ordinance. And there was specific language actually recommended. So it's about as close to a draft amendment as you're actually going to get. And I don't think there was any controversy. So that is one thing that could be done quickly and fairly discreetly. So maybe that could be part of your number 1 option.
Yeah, it could be included in the urgency ordinance. So then in that case, I would recommend under 2C of this motion. Yeah, I guess 1C. Okay, recommendation that 7.1 or let's see. Oh, it was kind of written. Okay. Yeah, the retail like definition go to the council on an urgency basis. Okay.
And yes, we can do that. And just so there's an expectation with the ad hoc, we may, just nuance that definition a little bit as we go forward and send that to the council. Okay.
We just have to understand and acknowledge that what is on our staff report right now in the presentation, it was just shorthand sort of recommendations.
So we should go revote on 1C real quickly,
Okay.
just so that's for the record.
Right, so you need to kind of put it in better wording or language for the ordinance itself.
Yes, and we do have that included in the attachment.
Mm.
That gets into the details of each of those recommendations. So that is the language that we will be carrying forward as we go.
Okay, and so we will re-vote on 1C.
Yep.
All in favor?
Yep.
3-0. I think 1C is going to be similar to what was put down on 1B, right? 2B.
And then we have not voted on 2C yet, which would be modified to say that recommendation 7.2 would be to return as soon as possible, meaning
So
6 months.
do we put analyze in front? So again, analyze recommendation 7.2.
So 7.2 is the midterm component. which is probably going to require a little bit more conversation with the PTC. They really wanted to understand the adjacencies and some of the details here. But advancing 7.2 would initiate that work.
Yes. Yes, okay.
And again, that one is not under the urgency direction because we just don't have enough information yet.
Correct.
PTC really wanted to engage further on that, and it just takes that more time to get through that.
In order to more clearly define what would apply where.
Yeah, and at this time, because of that, there is no
Specific
recommendation
recommendation.
All in favor of 2C?
Yes.
3-0. Let's see, what else are we missing? Did we do 5?
4 and 5.
4.
4, 5, 6.
So 4 is listed under item 3, which we'll get to, I think after 2, and then 5 and 6 are outstanding still.
So 5 is the comparative zoning land use table.
So it's largely a staff initiated effort, best management practice.
And that's
It's
a
not a
long
code
term.
change. It's not a code change. This is
It's
just
not.
a handout. I mean, it's something that we're going to do
I
probably
mean,
regardless of the.
right.
ad
So
hocs.
if you want to put, do we need to put it down? Okay. We don't need to do
If you just
anything with
if you
5.
just signaled your support for it, that would be great.
Okay, we support. Do we support? All in support?
Yes.
Yes. Are you? Yeah. Okay, 5 is, we're in support, so 6, apply alternative viable use standard when granting exceptions for GF and R districts. This is an amendment to the zoning code. Can you explain existing standard in retail is unconstitutional taking? I mean, we have a, okay, go ahead.
Basically, this recommendation would add more flexibility to the existing GF and R combining districts to establish a alternative viable use standard, which is the same standard that we used in the retail preservation ordinance.
I can certainly agree to put it under 2 so that you can take another look at it with PTC.
So, and I might invite Dan Duane here. I think this is another one where the language was somewhat vetted. It's a fairly specific recommendation in the I know again in the body of the staff report it's somewhat high level, but the attachment does include the actual recommendation. Dan, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, it's really taking that existing language from the RPO, which has a good standard. So there were 2 standards as an exception. So if somebody has a difficulty there, right now it says you can only do this if there's an unconstitutional taking of all economic use of your property. That's the highest standard you can get in zoning and land use. The RPO has this alternative viable active use option, which is a more pragmatic standard. Hey, is there something else? Is this really going to cause harm? This will be fine. This is a reasonable use. It's consistent with the nature of the retail area, for example. So that's the standard that we're recommending be extended from the RPO to the GF and R combining districts because they don't have that option right now. There's no effective relief valve.
And that would be under the urgency ordinance?
Well, yes, it could
could.
be, and PTC voted 7-0 in favor of
I
that.
would
would-
support including that under
Right.
the urgency ordinance.
Okay.
Yeah, we think that's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Okay, so all in favor?
Aye.
3-0.
And I have to say, I also have a drop dead at 11.
Okay. Is there any other?
I apologize, Chair Ku, what recommendation number was that?
That was number 6.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We haven't voted on 3 yet, is that correct?
No, I think we
We
did.
did.
Yeah, we
Okay.
did. So we did 1 through 8.
All right.
And we, if anything, I think we can keep the rest in midterm and the long term, right? Because number 9 and 10 is not recommended at this point. 15 is the comprehensive zoning update, which is a long term anyways.
can we just get the ad hoc support to not include or advance 9 and 10?
Yes, are we in favor of not extending 9 and 10?
Yeah.
Yes, 3-0. Is there anything else you need?
Does the ad hoc support moving 11 and 13 to 15?
I support that. Does the rest of the committee support that?
Yes.
Yes, 3-0. That's extending 11 to 13 to the not recommended section, or to 15 to the long-term code revisions.
And then
I-
support for
I
15 as well?
What, the extending, which recommendation number?
11, 12, and 13, we're gonna include it with number 15, which is under long-term code revisions.
I'm sorry. 12 is not no, we don't want 12 in there.
We don't want 11 and 13 to long-term with 15.
And then a separate action is to support recommendation 15, if that's the committee's support, just understanding there's resource and timing implications. with
Are
that
we
one.
all in favor of 15 supporting it?
Yes.
Yes, 3-0.
Yep.
Oh, we just need one last vote for all of it.
From straw to formal, sure.
Are you ready?
I apologize. Do we have a maker and a seconder?
I move it.
I'll second.
Okay,
Councilmember Burt,
Yes.
Councilmember Licca Hames,
Yes.
Chair Ku,
yes,
motion carries 3-0.
okay. So I think thank you so much. We'll, yes, so we will close item 1. We still have item 2. Can we just continue that since we have 2 committee members who have a
Yes,
hard drop?
happy to. And we will release another version of it for next month's meeting, and we'll continue to expand on the information contained therein.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Samuel, that's trial by fire.
Yeah.